Hello, my name is Tyler VanderWeele. I'm the Loeb Professor of Epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and also the Director of the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. I will be speaking today on human flourishing and education. I will begin by describing the concept of human flourishing and also different approaches to attempt to measure or assess flourishing. I'll go on to describe various positive psychological interventions and activities that can be used to promote human flourishing and could do so within school or classroom settings. I'll speak about education itself as a pathway to flourishing and how this flourishing lens can help make clear the importance of education for well-being. I'll conclude with some discussion of various implications of this notion of flourishing and of the possibilities for promoting well-being in educational contexts. More information on some of the material I'll be presented today is available in these papers listed on the slides in the Proceedings of the Academy of National Sciences and also in the Journal of Positive Psychology and Well-Being. You can find further information as well about the work of the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard at its website. So many of our academic disciplines aspire to grand visions of human flourishing. The World Health Organization defines health in its 1948 definition, a definition still in place today, as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Economics is sometimes conceived of as the study of how agents maximize their expected utility, supposedly taking into account all aspects of an agent's preferences. The discipline of positive psychology is sometimes described as the scientific study of the strengths that enable individuals and communities to thrive. But if we turn to our actual studies in these disciplines, we find that they're often restricted to very specific disease states or simple measures of positive affect or happiness, or the study of income. They don't encompass flourishing in this broad sense. So what is flourishing? If we turn to our dictionaries, we find the following. The Oxford English Dictionary flourishes to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way, or the American Heritage Dictionary to do or fare well. The etymology of the term comes from Latin florere, to bloom, blossom, or flower. It's often used to translate Aristotle's eudaimonia, sometimes also translated as happiness. The working definition we've been using at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard is that flourishing or complete human well-being is a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. And this is arguably what we are after as individuals and should be after as a community. But with a conception so broad, we might wonder how we might make any sort of progress at trying to measure or assess or improve flourishing. The discipline that I think has come the closest to doing so is that of positive psychology, which has put forward numerous measures of psychological well-being and conceptions of well-being. But noticeably absent from these measures of well-being are any notion of health. And are we truly healthy if we are not? Are we truly flourishing if we are not physically healthy, if we're bedridden, for example? Missing from many of these assessments, as well as any sort of notion of character or virtue, really contrary to Plato and Aristotle, really most of the Western philosophical tradition and philosophical, cultural, and religious traditions worldwide. The recent emphasis on character education likewise points critically to this notion of character or virtue as being a critical part of flourishing. But again, with a conception so broad, how would we go about measuring flourishing? And surely conceptions of flourishing are going to differ across persons and cultures and philosophical and theological traditions. So can we really achieve any consensus in a pluralistic society such as we live in if we are going to promote flourishing within education? Surely we need some sense of consensus to be able to advance this, and if we have this broad notion, how do we do so? And what I would argue is that while conceptions of flourishing will indeed vary across cultural and religious and philosophical traditions, I think there are common elements. I think any reasonable conception of flourishing would include the following 5 domains of human life. Not that flourishing is reducible to these 5 domains, but that any reasonable conception of flourishing, while it might include more, would include these 5 as well. And these are happiness and life satisfaction, mental and physical health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Again, I don't think these 5 exhaust our notion of flourishing, but they are arguably a part of it. I think each of these also satisfies the following 2 criteria. Each is nearly universally desired, and we have some empirical data up now on this as well. And each constitutes its own end. It's sought for its own sake and not simply as a means to some other ends. And I think these 2 criteria, being nearly universally desired and being an end in itself, might help shape consensus on what to measure and what to promote, even in pluralistic contexts. At the Human Flourishing Program, we have developed a brief index of human flourishing, essentially taking 2 questions in each of these 5 flourishing domains. Questions that have principally been selected from the existing well-being literature, questions that are used with considerable frequency and that have received some degree of empirical validation. The only 2 questions which were newly proposed were those on character and virtue, and although there's been tremendous advances with regard to the measurement of character in recent years, there is relatively little in terms of global assessment. And so working with philosophers, we proposed 2 fairly global questions based on the notion of the cardinal virtues, that at the foundation of all the moral virtues lie 4: practical wisdom, justice, fortitude or courage, and temperance or moderation. So the 10 questions that we've been using in our flourishing assessments in educational settings and elsewhere as well are as follows. The first domain, happiness and life satisfaction. First, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? And this is one of the most frequently used well-being questions used by the OECD and the UK's annual survey, and in many other contexts as well. And then something more about feeling happy, the affective side. In general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? Each of these scored 0 to 10, not at all satisfied, 10 completely satisfied, for example. And the second domain is then physical and mental health. First question on physical health. In general, how would you rate your physical health? Again, very commonly used question in various surveys. And then secondly, how would you rate your overall mental health, taken from the World Health Organization's surveys? The third domain is meaning and purpose. The first question here, overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? And this, again, is one of the most widely used well-being questions. It's again, it's been used in the UK's annual survey by the OECD and others as well. And then something more cognitive, I understand my purpose in life. The fourth domain is character and virtue. The first question intended in some very crude way to try to capture practical wisdom and justice. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. And then a second question or item aimed at assessing in a crude manner fortitude and temperance or moderation. I'm always able to give up some happiness now for a greater happiness later. Then the fifth domain, close social relationships. These were taken from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness survey of various items and measures that have been used for relationship satisfaction and loneliness. First item, I am content with my friendships and relationships, again, as the other one scored 0 to 10, essentially trying to capture the quantity or extent of those relationships. And then secondly, my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be, essentially trying to capture the quality of those relationships. In most of our work on flourishing and our assessments in school-based settings, we've looked at the scores in each of the individual domains because, as I will indeed describe later, patterns can be very different across these domains of flourishing. But one can also average all of the scores for an overall crude assessment of flourishing, but really this should be treated as nothing more than a composite of the 5 more meaningful individual measures. We do supplement these 10 questions with 2 others, essentially trying to assess financial and material stability. Essentially, does an individual have the means to sustain these other domains of flourishing over time? And the 2 questions we use in this final domain are first, how often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? One of the most commonly used questions in the financial well-being literature. And then also, how often do you worry about safety, food, and housing? And one could include this sixth domain as well, or average across all 12 questions for a more secure measure of flourishing. Possibly less satisfactory conceptually, since financial resources are arguably a means, not an end, but perhaps more satisfactory in practice and indicating flourishing over time. So this is what we've used in many of our flourishing assessments and workplace settings and community settings and medical settings and in university settings. In school settings, we do have an adolescent version of this measure with 4 items modified essentially to take into account the developmental stage of the participants. But otherwise, it works in a very similar manner. And I won't go into details here, but we have a number of papers showing good psychometric properties of the index as well. And when we've used this in different contexts, in addition to being useful for research purposes, I think it's been helpful for individuals to understand and think about and reflect on their own lives. The questions themselves provide an opportunity for self-reflection. It can also be helpful for sort of identifying areas of that may be in need of improvement or changes one wishes to make in one's life to try to address and improve various aspects of flourishing. It can be helpful for tracking over time to see if one's flourishing in these different domains is going up or down and what one might do about it. So some of the feedback that we have had in using this assessment in these different settings is as follows. Some questions made me stop and think, or it was pretty eye-opening to see the areas that I really need to work on. Again, opportunity for reflection, learning and discerning what changes one wants to make in life. Another response, relief that someone is asking. I want help in certain areas. Again, the tracking and the documentation can help identify individuals for whom additional outreach might be important. Or alternatively, slightly caught off guard with the questions around purpose, or missing a greater purpose, need to reach out more and give back. So again, the very nature of asking these questions can help people reflect upon their lives. And this sort of even just descriptive work on how flourishing is changing over time can be useful in terms of understanding what's happening in school contexts, in universities, or in society more broadly. And I'll be coming back to these points a little bit later in this talk as well. But just as an example, we've collected data on these flourishing measures in a roughly nationally representative sample of the United States, representative of the US on geographic region, gender, race, ethnicity, age, and also by weighting educational attainment and religious self-identification. And we've done this both in January of 2020, before the declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also June in the midst of it. And so unsurprisingly, flourishing as a whole has declined, but the patterns are very different across the domains. So you'll see the sample means in January and June in the 2 columns. And for several of the domains, there's been a fairly substantial decline that has taken place in happiness and life satisfaction, about 0.7, nearly a point on that scale. And likewise with mental and physical health, pretty substantial declines. Financial and material stability, again, about a point. The largest decline, which is indicative of the large levels of unemployment and employment insecurity that has resulted from this. But it's also interesting to note that some of the other domains seem noticeably less affected. Slight declines, but not all that substantial with regard to meaning and purpose, or character and virtue, or even close social relationships. A slight decline, but not very substantial. So we can see which aspects of well-being have changed more versus less, and which are perhaps most in need of being addressed. Importantly, also, the standard deviation of responses in all of these domains has gone up. So So responses have been more variable now. So while social relationships domain has only gone down a little bit, the increased variance indicates that for some, this in fact has been a time to invest in relationships or family or housemates, or to reconnect with distant relatives, and their social relationship scores have in fact gone up. But for others, this has been a very difficult time. They've perhaps been socially isolated without this normal means of community participation, and for them, social relationships has gone down. So it's important not only to look at the changes in means, and these do vary across these domains, but also to look at the fact that the standard deviations have been going up. So we can describe flourishing, we can evaluate and track over time how it's changing, and we can use it for purposes of self-reflection. But can we improve it then? And that is, of course, a critical question. I won't be able to go into great detail in this talk given our limited time, but I do want to spend some time on this important question, both at the individual level and at the community level, and in thinking about the role of education. I think one important set of resources that has been developed over the last few decades, which are relevant in school contexts, is a number of positive psychology interventions and activities that can be useful to try to promote flourishing in practice. And a number of these have been developed that can easily be done on one's own. I have a short review paper sort of going through the evidence of different activities, many of which have been tested and examined in randomized trials that can be used to promote various aspects of flourishing. So for example, one of the most prominent ones are gratitude exercises. Perhaps 3 times a week, write down 3 things that you're thankful for and why they came about. Do this for 6 weeks, and it's been shown in randomized trials and even meta-analyses of randomized trials that this has important effects on improving happiness and relieving depression and helping with sleep and self-reported health symptoms and so on and so forth. Likewise, carrying out acts of kindness, maybe once a week, choose a single day and try to do 5 acts of kindness to someone that you wouldn't ordinarily otherwise do. Or imagining one's best possible self in the future, and reflecting on that and writing about how one envisions that and how one might attain that, or trying to use one's character strengths in new ways each day. And these interventions or activities have been proposed, and I think well studied. And again, more details and evidence on this is available in this review paper, Activities for Flourishing, published in the Journal of Positive Psychology and Wellbeing. But activities like this could be encouraged in school-based settings. One could even imagine sort of a gratitude campaign or an acts of kindness campaign. And again, evidence that these things would improve well-being. Likewise, various workbooks have been developed to try to address various forms of psychological distress, including depression, anxiety, anger, and forgiveness. And these things aren't necessarily a substitute for professional mental health care, but can be helpful, I think, in addressing more mild symptoms. And these resources could likewise, I think, be widely disseminated in school and university contexts. I think these are important resources for education, to promote flourishing within education. And again, randomized trials have indicated pretty reasonable sized effects on happiness and life satisfaction, and also various aspects of mental and perhaps even physical health. Interestingly, the effects of these do-it-yourself interventions on other aspects of flourishing, like purpose or changing, improving character or social relationships, are somewhat less clear. The positive psychology interventions that have been designed to change purpose have not been as successful. And I think for these other domains of flourishing, we really need communities, we need longer-term commitments and relationships. And so we need to think about flourishing not just at the individual level, but also at the institutional level. And when I think about flourishing and trying to improve flourishing at the population level, I often try to use a public health lens. My own discipline is epidemiology, is public health. And when we think about the public health impact of an exposure or a phenomena or intervention, we often look at it through the lens of two criteria. First, how prevalent or common is the exposure or intervention or phenomena under study? And second, how large are its effects on the outcomes we care about? And if something is common and also has large effects on the outcomes that we care about, then it's going to shape population health. So if we look at physical health, examples of the major determinants of physical health using these two criteria are exercise or nutrition or not smoking or getting adequate sleep. But what would happen if we applied the same public health impact lens to not just physical health, but the other domains of flourishing as well: happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, close social relationships? What shapes all of these things? What is common and has large effects not just on physical health, but on each of these outcomes? If we apply that lens to this list of flourishing domains, we end up with a somewhat different list of potential determinants. And so based on a review of the prior literature on this topic, restricted to rigorous longitudinal studies over time and experimental and quasi-experimental designs, really trying to focus on the most rigorous studies, I would suggest 4 major pathways that promote flourishing in each of these domains. And those 4 are family, work, education, and religious community. There's evidence that each of these is relatively common in the population, and in rigorous longitudinal studies, each has a relatively large effects across the various flourishing domains. I don't think these 4 are necessarily exhaustive, and they're not, all 4 are not necessary. One can flourish in the absence of one of these. But again, each of these does powerfully affect flourishing. And I think if policy efforts were made to enhance the experience and improve life in each of these pathways, family, work, education, and religious community, population level flourishing would improve considerably. And so I want to focus briefly on education. Certainly some level of education is nearly universal, but of course the extent varies dramatically and the quality varies dramatically across contexts. And some of the earlier literature on happiness, say, and well-being had suggested relatively little association between educational attainment and happiness. But importantly, those studies were cross-sectional. They weren't the rigorous longitudinal studies that I'm talking about. And the problem with those cross-sectional studies is you really can't distinguish causal effects. You can't distinguish association and causation. And what was principally wrong with those studies is that they were controlling for the mechanisms by which education would lead to happiness and life satisfaction. They would adjust for, because they were cross-sectional, things like employment, or the likelihood of marriage, or income. These were the primary pathways by which education would in fact shape happiness and life satisfaction. And once one uses more rigorous longitudinal designs, you see that education really does affect happiness and life satisfaction as well. Also, evidence for an effect of education on improved physical and mental health, maybe stronger effects in the US than in Europe because of Europe's greater safety nets, but again, evidence for an effect on health as well. Evidence that education also leads to lower levels of crime, greater civic engagement. Effects on meaning and purpose are plausible, but there are in fact fewer rigorous studies on that, so more work to be done there. But evidence that education also improves social relationships, leads to greater community involvement, typically delays marriage, but makes marriage more likely, renders divorce less likely, so improves relationship quality, and of course pretty substantial returns on education to income as well. So I think education really does powerfully shape these various domains or aspects of flourishing, and more information on this literature review and summaries of prior evidence is available in that paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. But I do think education is one of the central pathways to promote flourishing across these various domains. And I think this work has and the notion of flourishing, this flourishing lens, has important implications in thinking about how to enhance flourishing within school settings, within education, and how to use education itself to enhance flourishing. So with regard to improving well-being within schools and universities, I think we really do need to start tracking education within education, we need to start tracking flourishing over time. We should start measuring it routinely. Why aren't we doing this in university context? We really want to know whether things are improving or getting worse, and doing so can help us understand which students may require further help. So I think this is something that should be done routinely, and that we're trying to do here at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard. I think the measurement also helps to ensure that well-being is part of the conversation. Well-being is part of what we're aiming for in education. It's of course not the only goal of education. Advancing knowledge and skills is critical. Developing competencies, but well-being should be a part of what we are aiming for, and really across these different domains of flourishing. And then finally, as I noted earlier, I think using the existing tools and activities and interventions to try to promote well-being, to promote gratitude and acts of kindness, to try to address questions of anger and forgiveness and depression. We should make use of these easy-to-use tools, which are widely available and can be easily disseminated. I think these are different ways which we can improve well-being or flourishing within school and university contexts. But as I noted earlier as well, I do think education itself is an important pathway to subsequent flourishing. And because of that, I think it's important that all students have access to good schools, good teachers, that we invest heavily in education in our society. Accompanying that, I think there's also a need to have a mechanism by which to let poorer, not well-equipped teachers to go, because it matters so much to students having good teachers that there needs to be such mechanisms in place as well. My own view would be that we should probably disconnect education funding from real estate taxes, so that we don't have such a sharp gradient between the neighborhood one lives in and the quality of education. I think we could make efforts to try to pay teachers more who are working in disadvantaged neighborhoods to really try to improve education in all the different settings, since it is such an important pathway to subsequent flourishing. So I think there are different ways and policies by which some of these things could be brought about, but I do think we need to think critically about education as an important pathway to flourishing. Some of the work we're currently doing, kind of one of the open frontiers of our work at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard, is not just how do we improve individual well-being and flourishing in schools and educational settings and in other contexts, but how do we improve the community itself? How do we enhance community well-being in schools? And we've developed a basic measure of community well-being that can be used across contexts, but one of those contexts is school-based settings. And this measure still in kind of preliminary stages of data collection and validation, but you can find more information in this paper in the International Journal of Community Wellbeing. But it tries to assess community well-being at the school level or in other community contexts across 5 domains: having good relationships within the community, having proficient leadership, having healthy practices within the community itself being satisfying, and having a strong mission within the community. And we've been collecting data in a variety of school settings, including a collaboration with the Shipley School and a number of others underway. And so we hope with this work we will likewise be able to track community well-being over time, and with further research also understand the determinants of community well-being at the school level, so that we can have both flourishing individuals and flourishing school communities as well. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and I do hope that some of these ideas are helpful in the promotion of flourishing, individual flourishing, and flourishing in educational communities more broadly. Thank you.